just minutes from landing. The runway lights of Madrid were already in sight. A Boeing 747 carrying nearly 200 people was descending through the night sky. Air traffic control had cleared the approach. The weather was mostly clear. Everything seemed normal. But something terrible happened. Instead of reaching the runway, it descended too low and slammed into rising terrain. This is the story of Avianca Flight 011, which was coined as the deadliest aviation accident in Spain. The flight was a scheduled international passenger service. It took off from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport at 10:25 p.m. The flight was heading to Bogotá, Colombia, with a scheduled stop in Madrid, Spain. After takeoff, it climbed normally and reached a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. On board were 169 passengers and 12 crew members. Most of the passengers were French nationals. 54 had boarded in Frankfurt. 116 had boarded in Paris. Among them were internationally known writers, poets, critics, and musicians invited to a cultural summit hosted by Colombian President Belisario Betancourt. At 11:31 p.m., the pilots contacted Madrid Air Traffic Control. The controllers instructed the flight to continue toward Madrid using several navigation points along the route. Everything was normal. About 15 minutes later, Air Traffic Control told the crew to begin descending to 19,000 feet as the aircraft approached Madrid. At 11:52 p.m., the controllers gave another instruction. The flight was cleared to descend further to 9,000 feet and continue toward the next navigation point. At 11:56 p.m., the pilots contacted Madrid Approach Control and were cleared to prepare for landing on runway 33. Around midnight, the aircraft reached 9,000 feet and continued descending toward Madrid. At 12:03 a.m., Madrid Tower gave the final clearance to land. But during the approach, something went wrong. The pilots were supposed to fly directly to the Madrid VOR, an important navigation beacon used to guide aircraft during the approach. However, the crew turned the aircraft before reaching the beacon. This early turn placed the aircraft off the safe approach path. The Boeing 747 continued descending and went below the minimum safe altitude for that area. Soon after, the flight hit a hill. The right landing gear and the number 4 engine struck the hill at a speed of about 142 knots. Only 3 seconds later, the flight hit another hill. At that moment, the plane was flying at 135 knots and slightly pointing upward. Just 6 seconds later, the aircraft hit the ground again. This time, the right wing struck the terrain and broke off. The Boeing 747 then rolled and broke apart into 5 pieces. Finally, the wreckage came to rest upside down on the ground. The wreckage burned through the early morning darkness. Hours later, it was still smoldering. The smell of burned fuel and twisted metal filled the air. Spanish authorities quickly set up a makeshift morgue at the crash site. Civil Guard General Constantino Gomez spoke grimly. "We have pulled out at least 100 bodies. The rest are burned beyond recognition. It is a miracle that anyone could have lived through this." One of the survivors, Hugo Bernal Cortés, described the moment. "I was suspended by my seatbelt because the plane was belly up. I somehow freed myself and kicked out one of the windows. I don't remember anything else." Other witnesses described seeing a young man emerging from the wreckage, carrying a small child, another little girl crying beside him. His clothes were burned. Rescue workers searched the debris under floodlights, pulling bodies from twisted metal. Spanish Army troops removed remains covered in blankets. The destruction was total. Investigation later found that several factors contributed to the crash, including pilot error, fatigue, and insufficient training. Although the pilots of Flight 011 were experienced, they were not fully familiar with the Instrument Landing System, ILS, used at Madrid Barajas Airport. The ILS is a navigation system that helps pilots align with the runway and land safely, especially in poor visibility. On the night of the accident, thick fog reduced visibility around the airport. The crew was using the ILS system to guide the aircraft toward the runway. However, during the approach, the Boeing 747 descended below the safe altitude. The aircraft first struck a hill, then hit two more hills within seconds. The third impact was the final one, causing the aircraft to break apart. As a result, wreckage from the plane was scattered across a wide area. Investigators later determined that the aircraft was flying too low and too fast during the approach. The crew also made several mistakes while handling the aircraft, including not properly following the correct ILS landing procedures. The crash of Avianca Flight 011 became an important lesson in aviation safety. It showed the importance of proper pilot training, managing pilot fatigue, and the risks of flying in poor visibility conditions. Among the victims were several well-known figures from the world of literature and culture. These included Mexican novelist Jorge Ibargüengoitia, Uruguayan literary critic Ángel Rama, Peruvian writer Manuel Scorza, Argentinian art critic Marta Traba, and Spanish pianist Rosa Sabater. In a single night, the world lost some of its brightest creative voices. Across Europe and Latin America, families woke up to the heartbreaking news that their loved ones would never return. The crash of Avianca Flight 011 was not the first time an Avianca aircraft had an accident near Madrid. In fact, it was the third such incident in the area. Spain had already witnessed one of the deadliest aviation disasters in history. In 1977, two Boeings collided at Tenerife Airport, killing 582 people. The tragedy shocked the entire world. Now, just a few years later, Spain once again became a place of international mourning. The disaster of Avianca Flight 011 would leave a lasting mark. It remains the second deadliest aviation accident in Spain, the worst crash in Avianca's history. But beyond the numbers, the crash carried an important lesson. In aviation, clear skies do not always mean safety. Even the most advanced aircraft cannot eliminate human error. And sometimes, even when the runway is in visible range, the danger is not over yet. We noticed something interesting. Almost 90% of the people watching our videos are not subscribed yet. If you enjoy these aviation stories and documentaries, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support really motivates us to keep researching, creating, and bringing you more powerful aviation stories and investigations.